Now, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Alexey Muraviev. Alexey is the Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin. He's also the founding director of the Curtin Strategic Flashlight Forum on National Security and Strategy. He's been a non-residential fellow at Sea Power Centre Australia, the Royal Australian Navy, and was an inaugural scholar in residence at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, a very well-known think tank on security and international affairs. He's published widely in the field of national security, strategic and defence studies, and his research includes problems of modern maritime power, contemporary defence and strategic policy, Russia as a Pacific power, transnational terrorism, and Australian national security. He's a very busy boy at the moment. He's very busy on the media. I've seen him a few times. He's regularly interviewed by national and international media, among them the ABC, BBC, the Australian, Sydney Morning Herald, CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Financial Times. That's just a few of them. And he's also a regular contributor at Sky News Australia as their resident strategic policy analyst. So it's actually amazing. We've managed to find him with some time to speak to us today. So thank you very much, Alexey, for finding time to speak to us. We're really looking forward to your talk. Over to you.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak at JICPPP Curtin Corner. John mentioned the Strategic Flashlight Forum, which I founded back in 2009, and that's been Western Australian premium professional forum to discuss issues of national security and strategy. And it gives me a great privilege to partner with another well-recognized and well-reputed platform that Curtin has been running for many years very successfully, John Curtin Institute for Public Policy, Curtin Corner. I also like to start by acknowledging traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. And I certainly would like to pay my respect to their leaders past, present, and emerging. What I would like to do today is to provide some major considerations with regards to this unfolding tragedy that is currently taking place. I'm not going to bore the audience with actual battlefield analysis, not going to focus on tactical or operational aspects. Happy to comment on them if there is any appetite in Q&A, but I just want to cover some basics and provide some preliminary observations about what we are observing and what we've been witnessing for the past 170 days plus minus, because this week marks yet another milestone in this unfolding tragedy. And that way I'd like to start this conversation by making the first point, subject that technology will not fail me. There is a well-known phrase or paraphrase which quite a few observers use with and take it or attribute it back to one of the founders of contemporary strategy, Prussian strategist and General von Clausewitz. The paraphrase suggests that the work is continuation of politics by other means. Certainly, someone who has been in the business of defense and defense analysis for nearly 30 years, I can certainly say that war is not a continuation of politics by other means, rather than a consequence of failed diplomacy. And this is really important to understand, that war is effectively consequence management of state failures to achieve their goals by means of other than politically motivated violence or politically sanctioned violence. So what we're witnessing now is the consequence of the failure of diplomacy, the failure of negotiations, the failure of the failure of the power of the word by many instances. And this is something that I certainly want to start my presentation with. The second point I want to make, specifically with regards to this war, but this is something that everyone is dealing with, is this phenomenon. Those who've been in the ranks would be quite familiar with this specific term, so-called the fog of war. The fog of war, with regards to operational application, is a reference to the situation where soldiers on the battlefield struggle to obtain situational awareness, trying to understand what the hell is going on and try to make sense of it. Lately it has become more of a narrative which can equally apply not only to the specific defense setting, but also to any other form of setting when we're trying to understand what the hell is going on when violence erupts. And certainly the fog of war phenomenon is something that complicates the analysis and complicates the understanding of the whole process of associated with war, but also with the business in which I'm heavily involved, unfortunately, in the business of defense analysis or war analysis. So when it comes to these particular circumstances, the war with Ukraine, Russia's war with Ukraine, the Ukraine war or Russia's war on Ukraine with the West, what does constitute this fog of war? I would certainly propose the following. First of all, there are three key pillars that complicate the analysis and also affect people's judgments, more importantly, views and perceptions about this war. First of all, it's incredible politicization of the conflict. I certainly cannot remember or cannot recall such a politicization of the conflict since probably the end of the Cold War confrontation. There is a lot of propaganda and disinformation, which sort of is instigated by all sides involved in the conflict. That also complicates the analysis further, as well as people's general understanding and perceptions of the war. And certainly not to put it the least, but probably among the first is people's expectations, and not just people, but also professional expectations, as well as pre-war assessments. There was a lot of hype about this conflict, of which I will speak about in a moment. And certainly, like every other conflict, things do not go in accordance with your initial scenario, with your initial desires. So overcoming that sort of predetermined outlook that someone would create in their head or in their assessments for that matter is a massive challenge. And I can see there is a lot of struggle with that even now, even though the war has been going on for more than a few months now. So what does it mean for say, the civilian side of the community, as well as the professional side or the defense side of the community? From speaking about challenges and trying to cut through the fog of war for the civilian, for non-professionals, non-combatants as well, there are a couple of things that actually contribute to this complexity. One, this is the most filmed or recorded conflict in the history of warfare. I haven't remembered this. First of all, the size and the scale of conflict is profoundly different to what we have observed to date. If we'll be thinking about NATO's operation against Yugoslavia in 1999, the war in Iraq in 2003, the Libya conflict of 2011, a number of emergencies between India and Pakistan, including the Kargil incident of 1999, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 2020, the list goes on. But none of these conflicts reach the same magnitude, they reach the same scale, the ferocity and catastrophic consequence as the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And certainly the amount of media that's been thrown into the social space deliberately or as bystanding witness, certainly on one hand presents an ample opportunity to watch the war like we've never seen it before. On the other hand, it complicates the problem, creates additional problem for analysts, because it's very hard to authenticate what you are seeing. Is this something that is real, or is this something that is actually falls into that pillar? The problem for the civilians, we've all been subjected to a certain narrative that's been presented by all sides involved in the conflict. And as a result, we're all victims of the war propaganda because we choose to take sides. I certainly haven't experienced with respect to previous conflicts and this conflict, people that do not have a side, do not have a take on a particular matter. Very few tend to remain neutral. Everyone tends to sort of sideline with a particular side. There is a lot of penification of perceptions as well as angles and interpretations to justify your side's perspective, to justify your own perceptions. And again, that also complicates the issues, particularly if we're dealing with some sort of preset expectations and as well as expectations with regard to how this war was supposed to run in the first instance and how it's been running in the initial stages and how it's running now. And that also links to another problem. How do you adjust to the dynamic change? Some people would kind of get fixated in one particular mindset, and it's very hard for them to recognize and realize the evolving nature of the conflict. And certainly, and again, this is no one's fault, it's part of the human nature. People also getting tired of hearing about violence and violent stories and reporting about violence on daily basis. So clearly by now a lot of elements in the community experiencing what I would describe as war fatigue. But again, war fatigue is not something that can only be attributed to the non-defense side of the community. There is battlefield fatigue for those who are actually fighting, and certainly by now both sides who are heavily engaged in the conflicts are suffering from that. Another key challenge is that military professionals face with respect to this war, but any other war, and this is something that is important to remember for anyone who is actually interested in trying to understand the situation on any battlefield. The war never goes to the original plan. You know, if there is an expectation that you will go from point A to point B to point C, or from paragraph A to paragraph B to paragraph C, doesn't work like that. In over 90% of cases, war is an improvisation. It's a chaos and improvisation in response to changing circumstances, because you never have a compliant adversary. The adversary needs to be taken with respect. The adversary needs to be taken seriously. Otherwise, you'll end up on the losing end of it. And obviously that is linked to another point. Never underestimate or overestimate your adversary, because going extreme, going overboard with your assessments and analysis, and that's obviously been the case prior to the eruption of the conflict. And I'll speak more about this as well, affects your judgment down the track. How do you achieve secrecy and concealment when the wall has been filled so much? And that's a massive challenge that the military is involved in the conflict is currently facing, as well as a big question that we don't discuss a lot here in the West, but nonetheless something that I believe is really important with respect to determining the outcome of the war is motivation and morale of troops on the ground. You can have the best equipment, you can have the best technology available to you, but if you have no will to fight, if you have no motivation to defend or follow your tasks or duties, well, then you're going also to be on the losing side of things. Again, Russia's invasion in Ukraine did not come as a surprise. There was a lot of hype about it from probably second part of last year. So that road to war took a pretty long time, and there was a lot of discussion. And I remember, because I was involved in a lot of these discussions on when the war will start, or if the war will start. And why would this war start in the first place? And so the expectation and the negative excitement about this, or excitement in brackets about this, started to build up from about late October, November, when Western intelligence began collecting evidence about the gradual massing of Russian forces along the Ukrainian border, along the line of separation between the Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists in rebel-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine, in Russian-held Crimea, etc. But there was still a lot of doubt, and I certainly expressed my doubts at that time whether Putin would actually press the button or give marching orders to his troops. However, things began, and that was also driven by Certainly in my analysis, pre-war analysis, it was driven by the fact that we have to give full credit to the Ukrainian military. Something, again, speaking post factum, wasn't taken very seriously, not just by the Russians. The Russians certainly made significant error of judgment when they assumed that the Ukraine military of 2021, 2022 order of battle was very much the same military as they have silently confronted at the time of the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. It was a different force. It was the Ukrainian military of the past 8 years transformed themselves into a much better equipped force, better aligned with NATO. The level of interoperability, particularly with regards to situational awareness, intelligence, reconnaissance, have been quite impressive because it affected all levels, and certainly something that's gradually been translated on the battlefield. There's been a cleansing within the Ukrainian military of those who would be considered semi-loyal to Russia, would have affiliations or affection with the former Soviet Union, particularly that affected the officer corps. So the Ukrainian military of 2022, by the time the war erupted, was driven by a different type of officer corps, motivated ideologically, ideologically motivated, upskilled, and a lot of them being trained in Western defense institutions and establishments. There's been a lot of injection in the training and capability, equipment, etc. But there was one challenge that the Ukrainian military have faced, even though a lot of them went through the so-called counterterrorism operation at that time, how it was described, against pro-Russian separatists. Some 400,000 of Ukrainian military personnel gained combat experience over the 8 years of low-level fighting. But the Ukrainian military, just like the Russian military for that matter, didn't have the experience in high-tempo operations, meaning fighting a war against a large professional military force. And again, this is something that the Russians also failed to gain, because their combat experience in Syria was not near close to what they ended up confronting in Ukraine. But why am I saying that it wasn't just the Russian military that underestimated the Ukrainian? If you would go through the now pre-war assessments made by Western intelligence and Western militaries, they also gave no credit to the level of resilience of the Ukrainian military. The war game situations performed by the United States military in a number of institutions, and I'm here only referring to unclass information, would give the Ukrainians about a week and a half, 2 weeks of maximum resistance against the Russian invading forces. So even though we've been supporting the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian military upgrades, we assumed prior to the beginning of hostilities that Ukraine will have no chance in withstanding Russian aggression, and they would not last more than a fortnight. That was our assessment, not just the Russian assessment. So both of these sides, of us as the West as well as Russia, got the Ukrainian military wrong. And certainly that presented a big surprise, not just for the Russians, but also for the West, who began reassessing and rethinking their level of commitment to Ukraine, because in the initial weeks of the war, there was, apart from political commitment and the war of sanctions on Russia, there was not much logistical support coming to the Ukraine, simply because there was an expectation that Ukraine will suffer defeat very, very quickly. But things began turning dramatically, also because, again, the Russian political military leadership assumed that if they would pursue the military option with Ukraine, it would be as bloodless or as painless as the annexation of Crimea, or even military successes that their forces and pro-Russian separatist forces achieved in 2015 during the campaign in eastern Ukraine. There was gradual buildup of force, and suddenly things began looking incredibly alarming, and this is something I certainly reflected upon in my pre-war analysis, when there was a mass transfer of Russian forces from Sino-Russian border. And clearly that was also a result of probably some sort of an agreement and understanding between Moscow and Beijing that allowed the Russian military to mass some 11 brigades. And that's a significant chunk of their firepower that's normally stationed in the country's eastern regions, in Belarus and on the border with Ukraine. And certainly the maneuvers that the Russians and Belarusians were running there, which came to an end just 4 days before they declared invasion, were all signs suggesting that Russia was ready to exercise force and ready to move in, which obviously occurred in the early hours of February the 24th. And that's certainly one of the questions that was posed at that time, whether Russia would be prepared to go without having some sort of a consent from China to ensure that its exposed eastern border will not be compromised in any way. So what did drive Russia's decision, or Moscow's decision, or Putin's decision for that matter, to invade Ukraine? Well, we can have a discussion about a variety of reasons, but again, applying military, political, or geostrategic analysis, the following really drives the thinking and Russia's thinking and decision to exercise deadly force against a sovereign nation. It's all about the phenomenon called the buffer. The buffer is a reference to a safety gap that exists between potential or real adversaries. It may be a reference to a territorial strip. It may be a reference to a time zone that would allow you to make a decision in times of danger. During the Cold War confrontation, or following the end of the Second World War, the Soviet buffer was the entire Central and Eastern Europe. Effectively, the Soviet bloc represented that safety zone that Moscow built to protect itself from any future invasions based on the experience of Napoleonic invasion, World War I, and certainly Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Following the end of the Cold War, Europe's strategic landscape transformed radically. The former Soviet space was gradually absorbed into the political, military, and geoeconomic space of the West, of the collective West. A lot of the majority of former Soviet allies, members of the Moscow-led Warsaw Pact, became later on members of NATO. A lot of them joined the European Union, but obviously that wasn't as much of a concern to Russia, rather as much as the gradual expansion of NATO. And when it became clear that NATO was gradually approaching and sort of, expanding its presence along the border with Russia, not just the former Soviet space, it turned out that the only two elements of the Romanian buffer was effectively Belarus, Russia's ally, and Russia invested a lot in retaining friendly regime there of Alexander Lukashenko. If we remember the unrest in the country in the second half of 2020. And then came Ukraine. Ukraine with Georgia, marked here on the smaller map, which was identified as the next line of likely candidates to join NATO. For Russia, having Ukraine was a big no-no. So when it became very clear that NATO is not going to engage in any sort of negotiations with Russia, Putin initially launched, at that time, he said, a number of letters issued by Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. De facto, it was an ultimatum, which was launched in December 2021 to the United States, to NATO, effectively saying, let's discuss, this is your last chance, otherwise we as Russia will resort to so-called military and military technical response. That ultimatum, which was done in a pretty harsh diplomatic language, it was sort of actually bordering diplomatic language and just blunt collection of statements, effectively reflected what I would describe as strategic paranoia. When the country develops an anxiety based on historical experience and also develops this narrative, certainly something that was promoted by Vladimir Putin over the years, that history should not be repeated itself. 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis should not be never repeated, and will do, as we as Russia will do anything possible to ensure it's not going to happen. And that fixation on the evolving threat, on the mounting threat, and the fact that your country is under the attack, and you're obviously not doing it just for the sake of engaging in some sort of power diplomacy, but also there is a lot of domestic element attached to that, and the fear inducement element helps to mobilize the nation and certainly fortify the power of the ruler. And this is something that became part of Russia's strategic agenda. But when you get fixated on this over the years, that fear and that uncertainty turns into what I describe as strategic paranoia, and you start preempting things based on your perceptions, based on your estimates, based on your analysis, and analysis tend to prove inaccurate from time to time. So Russia's annexation of Crimea was driven by a preemptive a series of sort of perceived understandings that if we're not going to be there tomorrow, NATO will be there the day after tomorrow, and there's going to be ethnic cleansing and genocide against ethnic Russian population, the list goes on. Same went with regards to an attempt to bring under control contested parts of the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine, and certainly Russia's aggression against Ukraine on 24th of February was also driven by this expectation that we need to be there first because we believe Ukraine will be attacking us in a few weeks' time. So once again, this sort of heightened fear, the hype turned into strategic paranoia as a result. Executive decision has been made, and we're now facing the consequences of that decision. So briefly on the war conduct, again, this is not the prettiest part, and I don't want to dwell into real detail about it, but again, happy to take any questions later on. And why I'm calling in 2022 campaign? Because I don't believe the war will finish by the end of this year. When it started, there was a lot of talk whether it would last 2 weeks, a month, couple of months. Now we don't even know the end game. But what we know to date is, so far, Russia's campaign against Ukraine went through 2 major phases. The first phase, which was launched on the day of the invasion, when the Russian invading forces penetrated parts of Ukraine from 4 different directions. There was a massive and quite successful assault on the south, which allowed Russia to capture significant parts of Ukrainian territory. Some advance showed Russia's progress about 100 kilometers a day, which was pretty staggering at the time. There was a similar massive assault on Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, from neighboring Belarus, which de facto or by default joined Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But then it all started looking pretty gloomy for the Russians, because the level of Ukrainian resistance took everyone by surprise, not just the Russians, but also by the West, because we truly believed that Ukraine would only last a couple of weeks, not that sort of level of resistance that they began showing. There was also a lot of misjudgment and miscommunication on Russia's side. There were errors of judgments made by commanders, because they believed that this is Syria or this is Crimea 2014, when they began paddling through deep into Ukrainian territory without thinking, protecting logistical lines of supply, without expecting any form of resistance. There was a lot of political intervention directly from Putin, which was not a welcome news in Russia, and certainly something that he has suffered a lot in terms of loss to the image, including his decision to withdraw Russian forces from the outskirts of Kyiv as a result of the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul in late March, which was supposed to pave way to some sort of ceasefire and follow political dialogue. Didn't eventuate. Russia withdrew its presence from the outskirts of the Ukraine capital, even though In the early stages, it looked like capital was about to be overtaken. There was a mass exodus out of Kiev. Embassies were evacuated. People fled in hundreds of thousands, and certainly it looked pretty horrific. However, the Russians removed their forces, some by their unilateral design, others by the president, not welcomed by the troops at all, and that's why he lost his face in the eyes of their own troops. Some because the Ukrainians pressured the Russians back, but a lot of emphasis was given to the south of the country, where Russia was making some significant gains. An emphasis was given to the so-called liberation of Eastern Ukraine, liberation of Donbass. So that was one of the declared goals that Putin announced prior to the commencement of this war. And Russia doesn't classify this as the war, by the way. They call it special military operation, even though by default it's the war. The Russians pressured on breaking into and establishing a land corridor between Crimea and mainland Russia, which resulted in over a month-long siege of Mariupol, the major port on the Sea of Azov, which was eventually captured by the superior Russian force. And after that, Russia's emphasis was given to the Battle of Donbass that's been going on for almost 2 months now. Very slow progress, fierce resistance from the Ukrainian. And the Russians changed their tactics, actually reduced the number of the invading forces and relying more and more on the superior firepower and the air power, and as well as their missile capabilities. So this is where we're at. We're sort of at the end of stage 2. Once the battle for Donbass will come to an end, we'll see a gradual phase into stage 3. And obviously by the time of stage 2, the West gained confidence that Ukraine will not be overrun within days or within weeks, that you can actually increase stakes in the conflict. Also fearing that if Russia will win the battle for Ukraine, that it will not stop there. And I certainly can say that already there is a chatter in Russian state-controlled media that Poland may be next or someone else may be next. So the Russians very optimistic, and the appetite growing whilst you're having a meal. That's an old Russian saying, and I think this is what Moscow is experiencing. There was a bit of a shock about the level of Ukrainian resistance, but there is a kind of gradual regained confidence in Moscow about the outcome of the campaign. Parallel to the gained confidence that the West have got now in Ukraine and the capability of the Ukrainians to defend their homeland quite successfully. So we're talking about battle of wills now, apart from other matters. So where do we go from here? Again, you know, what I have said about cutting through the fog of war, we have to recognize this is a highly dynamic development. There is nothing that's been set in stone. Things are progressing, things are moving constantly, and it's important to keep your mind open and adjust your analysis as well as your prognosis. So my prognosis as of today may become irrelevant in a couple of weeks' time, because there may be a dramatic change and shift. So what needs to be recognized so far as of 12th of August? Despite an incredibly slow progress and the transformation of the war from high tempo war into the war of attrition, and it's important to acknowledge, whether we like it or not, but Russia has retained strategic initiative. So far, it's been driving the war conduct. Yes, the level of Ukrainian resistance has been absolutely tremendous, and I think there is a standing ovation that Ukraine receives from Europe, from the United States, from us here in Australia, for their courage, for their bravery, for their determination. But it's important to put things in the perspective. There is Russia with world #2 military force, even though there is a lot of skepticism about its current ranking, but it's still an enormous military capability. And then there is Ukraine with a very determined leader and a very determined army, but it's still on the defensive. Ukraine has failed to demonstrate any significant gains. They managed to achieve from time to time tactical successes, but the Russians continue to overwhelm them and overpower them. Also because there is lack of appetite by the West to interfere in the conflict or escalate it to the point when the Russians will start escalating it further. Because, as I said, the Russians actually run this war. Well, I haven't said it, I'm stating it now. Russia is running this war on the budget, meaning Putin refuses to call on mobilization. Putin uses the same troops to effectively cover a front line that exceeds 2,000 kilometers. It goes against even the military logic when the invading force is numerically smaller than the defending force. There are about 500,000 Ukrainians that confront about a force of 150,000 Russians and separatist backed forces. And that's from the military perspective, from the military strategy perspective, that's a bit of a kind of nonsense, because you need to have 3 times to 4 times superiority to make a significant advance. But obviously Putin wants to pretend that the war is happening elsewhere, but not in his country. He doesn't want to put additional pressure on the economy, which is suffering under sanctions. He doesn't want to create anxiety in people's minds. So it's the war of attrition from his end. Ukraine lost 25% in addition to what pro-Russian separatists and Russia control since 2014. Just to put it in the perspective, what Russia managed to gain since February is roughly the size of Finland or Spain, if we're talking about the combined strength. Yes, there was a lot of expectation that by now Russia should control the entire territory of Ukraine, but we need to remember geographically Ukraine is one of the largest countries in Europe. It has a very complex geography due to a number of features, including heavy urbanization, industrialization. It's the first country where we see war fighting has taken place on the territory, with 15 nuclear reactors, 4 registered nuclear sites. It's a paradox. We haven't seen, we haven't had this experience in the past. What I predict will happen once Donbass will be taken, and I think it's really little doubt that the Russians will succeed in securing Donbass, also because President Zelensky ordered evacuation, and normally evacuation precedes the retreat. The battle will be waged for the control of so-called Eastern Ukraine. Ukraine is divided by this massive river called the Dnieper River into 2 parts: Eastern Ukraine, or left bank Ukraine, Central and Western Ukraine. I think the 22 campaign will focus on the battle for the remains of Eastern Ukraine. Russia may consider launching further assault to cut Ukraine off the Black Sea coast, and by that stripping Ukraine of the capacity to enter the maritime domain, unless Ukraine will wage counteroffensive, something the Ukrainian authorities were talking about for a while, something that the West expects Ukraine to do, also to demonstrate that there is actually output for the investment that goes into the Ukraine and the Ukrainian military. So that's what I believe will happen between now and the end of the year. But then comes what's next, and certainly from the invaders' perspective, you know, what is there for Vladimir Putin, how far he is prepared to go, and again, this is something that I believed would actually deter Putin from going into Ukraine in the first instance. That was part of my pre-war analysis, that the Ukraine now is not exactly Ukraine pre-2013 or 2014. There is a lot of hostility towards Russia on the basis of its annexation of Crimea, separatist support of the past 8 years, etc. So the further westwards Russia will move its forces, the cooler the reception is going to be from the locals. Yes, there has been no significant popular resistance on the territories that were occupied by the Russian forces to date, with the exception of the Kiev direction and Chernihiv direction in the country's north and northeast. The population in the south felt pretty relaxed about being taken by the Russians. I think they're in the mode of wait and see, even though there's been acts of resistance and acts of sabotage, but that hasn't been systematic. It's more been driven by infiltration groups. But the key problem that Russia is facing, who is going to run the country or parts of the country that Russia will occupy. There is no pro-Russian opposition that is existence in Ukraine. It's all been cleansed over the past 8 years. And that's certainly been one of my points. Maybe my logic kind of failed me in this sense that I thought Vladimir will not actually think it through and will not proceed with marching orders, but obviously I was wrong. But another thing is Russia will need to invest in Ukraine. Ukraine was not at the best shape, so the eastern parts of Ukraine were not at the best shape prior to the war. Now the country is in ruins, so Russia will have to spend so much in rebuilding the ground infrastructure, now from rubble, not even from being sort of run down and overlooked or undermaintained. Now it will have to be rebuilt from rubble. How Russia will manage it in the state of sanctions, the fact that Russia needs to rebuild its own infrastructure, that's a massive challenge, and that may actually predetermine how far Russia will prepare to go, if it will feel that it can actually continue with its current advance and Ukraine will not pull a surprise or two for the Russians, which I think it may before the end of the year. So what are the takeaway lessons? And sorry for misspelling it. Obviously, English is my second language here. Let me start by giving you a couple of takeaways, since the focus of this presentation is on political military analysis. So giving you the military strategic perspective. I think we can kiss goodbye, and I'm sorry for not sounding very politically correct or diplomatic here, any expectation that the possibility of war is a remote possibility. And this is not just an expectation that is shared still a lot by the members of the civilian community. This is something that has actually been indoctrinated in the Australian strategic and defense thinking. That's been reflected in our defense white papers to date, that the threat of a major war is a remote possibility. I think what this war is showing, as well as crisis in Taiwan, is showing that the threat of a major war is real, and we have to be ready for it psychologically, economically, militarily. This conflict also shows that nuclear deterrence works to some extent. And what I mean by that, the West's reluctance to interfere in this war is also driven by the fear that Putin may press the button. Putin was very blunt about the resorting to nuclear option should NATO intervene directly into the conflict, or should the United States cross several more red lines that Putin have identified in terms of enhanced military assistance and support. So the fact that we see accelerated military aid to Ukraine, but no combat troops committed, no direct military pressure applied against Russia, that means that nuclear deterrence does work. And I mean, same thing applies with regards to the crisis between China and the United States. It's the contest between nuclear armed nations. So, and certainly on the other hand, there is a restraint on Russia's part, because if it will start following promises that it made before, including like hitting centers that make strategic decisions with respect to this war, and the Russians have been arguing for a long time, and Russian propaganda has been arguing for a long time, that these centers are not based in Kiev and Ukraine's capital, but rather than in Brussels and Washington. But obviously, none of these targets have been hit yet, simply because Russia also understands and appreciates the question of nuclear deterrence, that in case of the war taken to a different level, it will escalate from the conventional to unconventional phase. However, the risk of a nuclear conflict remains, and no one can say and no one can guarantee it's not going to happen. So we're now living in a heightened state of war escalation, with the potential of the conventional conflict risking transferring into the nuclear phase, simply because we are seeing nuclear powers being directly involved in the confrontation here. And this is, again, radical departure from all our expectations and thinking of the past 30 years, that the end of the Cold War, meaning the end of all wars. The final point in the military political and military strategic angle is you cannot really judge how good your troops are. You cannot really judge how good your military power is unless you start fighting. You can have fancy maneuvers, you can have fancy parades, you can have shiny uniforms, you can operate really good looking equipment and perhaps equipment that is also been influenced by pretty sleek design. But unless you start performing on the battlefield, that's what really judges and determines how good or how bad you are. And this is certainly something that would reflect a lot of analysis on Russian military power right now, on the Ukrainian military power right now, but also something that I think it's important to take away from this conflict with respect to the Western militaries. Unfortunately, we don't know how good are we going to be on the battlefield. And I'm not trying to be kind of skeptical or dismissive about our capability, but again, we can have simulations on war games. But over the past 20 years, we have been training and gearing up and confronting different type of enemy, either an inferior military power, like, for example, Iraq under sanctions, or Libya, or we've been focusing on contingencies such as terrorism, insurgency, etc. Do we think about the threat of terrorism in the same way as we thought about this even 5, leave alone 10 years ago, leave alone 20 years ago? I don't think so. We now that risk has now been overshadowed, and the prominence of that has been now overshadowed by something a bit more significant and staggering. So whilst Russia is not really doing magnificently on the battlefield, one of the things that we need to also recognize, and again, ensuring that we don't underestimate our adversaries, is they're gaining invaluable combat experience, just like the Ukrainian military is gaining invaluable combat experience, something that the Western military continue to lack, including the United States military, because today they have not been fighting a war with a determined and roughly comparable military power. And the Ukrainian military, as I said, was severely underestimated by all sides that had stake in this conflict. And finally, I want to sort of elevate it to the political element. A major problem that we face right now is in international affairs. There is no respect for each other, and there is no trust for each other. And that accelerates risks that I want to highlight here. During the Cold War, even though there was a massive ideological rivalry, there were both nuclear powers and their allies and affiliates were working on the brink. But there was one thing that was present there that is absent now. There was respect. There was recognition and respect for the other side. In the absence of such recognition and respect, which is quite evident with regards to all sides of the conflict, and I'm not talking about Russia and Ukraine, I'm talking about Russia and the West. Also, the problem of leadership. We don't have responsible leaders. We don't have leaders that can manage crisis of this magnitude effectively, that can understand the ferocity and the dangers of modern military power, including this option, the nuclear option. We don't have leaders, as we did during the Cold War, that had had combat experience. We need to remember that heads of the United States and the Soviet Union exercised self-restraint because they were World War II veterans. They knew firsthand what the military machine unleashed can do. These days we have party bureaucrats and politicians have very limited understanding of what does it take to be Supreme Commander-in-Chief, or what does it take to be a leader in times of crisis. And that certainly escalates the risks of things going wrong, or something that, and this is where I will finish and leave you with, something that was cleverly manifested in one of the blockbusters of the 20th century that can effectively highlight what it can lead to unless things will be worked out. And I think that's what we've been experiencing so far. I'll finish here. Thanks very much. John, over to you.
That's great, Alexei. Thanks very much. Do you want to maybe just stop sharing and we can just talk on the screen that way? Might work better. That was fantastic. And I'll just let people, but no big deal if you can't do it, that's fine. I'm just letting people know, Slido, there's lots of questions already up on Slido, many of which are relevant to what we've just been talking, what Alexei is talking about, of course. So just go to www.slido.com or download the app, and our code is JCIPP. So you got plenty of questions here, Alexei, so let's get into them straight away. My first question actually was what would victory even mean for Russia or Ukraine? So, sometimes they say, declare victory and walk away, and sometimes you do that early on because you're not actually doing so well. But what would victory mean?
Look, I think at this point in time, I'll probably say not losing your face. Because we sort of in a situation that all sides involved, including the ones that involved in this conflict indirectly, and that certainly includes the United States, Europe on one hand, and now we see an increasing covert involvement of, say, countries like Iran, China, and others. Well, North Korea is a latest addition to this on the other side. None of the sides, but we're talking about primarily participants of the conflict, Russia and Ukraine, both of them have invested so much into this that losing the face would be a sign of defeat. We can talk about territory, we can talk about people which go under the control, we can talk about damaged economic potential and catastrophic consequences, but I think there is so much at stake right now because this is such a politicized conflict that losing the face or saving the face, if we're talking about victory, that would be the ultimate, that would be considered to be a victory for any side.
So I can understand not losing might be seen as a good thing, but how can both sides not lose? Because I assume for Ukraine to lose a quarter of its territory would they lose face, or if Russia had to withdraw from the 25% of its territory of Ukraine that it currently holds, that would lose face. So maybe the risk is greater on the Russian side for losing face than it is for Ukraine.
Look, obviously there is most at stake for Russia simply because there was a different set of expectations of Russia as world number 2 military power. So for Putin, obviously, to make any form of concession would be equivalent to a defeat, and that's how his actions in late March, early April were interpreted when he ordered his troops to withdraw from Kiev, and they were pressured by the Ukrainians also, by the way. And it was at that time considered almost like this is the start of Russia's defeat. For Ukraine, it's about agreement to the current status quo. That would be their sign of defeat, meaning that they would accept that Russia would not just retain control over Crimea and separatist controls areas of Donbass, but also now parts of Kherson, Zaporozhye regions in the southern parts of Ukraine, which I showed. That would be an equivalent loss. If the Ukrainian government will be forced to negotiate on these terms, it wouldn't matter anymore whether Russia will gain more territory or not. The fact, I don't think the Ukrainian government can actually afford to accept that Russia has jurisdiction over Crimea, let alone newly controlled territory. But again, that also runs into this, reality check. How can one come to terms when there are such fundamental disagreements on both sides? What will force them to come to negotiations? Because we need to remember any conflict finishes at some point in time, and it finishes with a political outcome. And I think one of the reasons why the war drags on is because no side has been prepared to formulate where it is willing to compromise, because a compromise can also be interpreted as a form of defeat. So I think one of the reasons why we see this war dragging on is not just because there is still a hope in both Moscow and Kyiv that somehow they can win this conflict, but also because they don't have a fallback solution at this point in time.
Okay. Tim Diamond, hi Tim, regular viewer, asks, does this conflict stand out from recent ones in that we have two modern standing armies fighting each other, in contrast to insurgents versus occupiers like in Iraq? And that might also raise the question that you mentioned right at the end there about, you find out how good your troops are by being in battle. But of course, there's a difference between battles, countries versus countries, as opposed to fighting insurgents in Afghanistan or in Iraq.
It does stand out because, first of all, it's the scale. Remind me, when was the last time we've seen the front line extending to 2,500 kilometers? Remind me, when was the last time you've seen effectively classical World War II style warfare, massive employment of artillery, massive employment of firepower, the entire country becoming the battlefield. The level of combat losses there is something unprecedented, something that we haven't experienced again since Vietnam. I mean, the level of Russian losses in Ukraine by far exceeded the total combined losses that the Soviets have suffered in Afghanistan over 10 years of occupation. I mean, some estimate that Russian casualties reached some 60,000. Some say 80,000. The Russians claim that they killed nearly 100 or 200,000 Ukrainians. But clearly, we're talking about, again, I'll use a military term and I'll explain what it is. We're talking about each side losing approximately a brigade, a battalion a day. A battalion is about 800 to 1,000 personnel, depending on the composition. Something that the Western military never thought of and never experienced, because if you start comparing it to the level of losses, say, during Operation Iraqi Freedom 2003, or Operation Allied Force against Yugoslavia, we were talking about dozens, not hundreds a day, dozens in total. So the level of ferocity, the level of the scale of the confrontation, and we're not just talking about the battlefield, we're talking about cyberspace, we're talking about space, we're talking about the entire integrated approach. So this is the first time we've seen something like that occurring, certainly in Europe, since 1945. So it's fundamentally different, and that's where trying to put an old head and trying to compare this conflict to anything that happened of the past 30 years is just inappropriate.
Okay. Just leading on before I get to the question from Dora Marinova, who is a great question, but I just wanted to, Andrew Maxey has asked a question which sort of relates to what you just said. At what point does Putin come under pressure due to casualties from, the mothers of Russia, and does that ever cause him to halt or slow his attacks? Because we were told that part of the reason why the Soviets had to pull out of Afghanistan eventually was, body bags coming back, etc. But I assume there's a lot more happening in a lot faster time in Russia now. So is there any pressure on him on the home front from a casualty point of view?
No, and I think this is, once again, we need to get a reality check. The Russians rally behind Putin. His level of support is 80%. Again, this is something that I will get into more with a professional analysis. There's been some assessments done during the Cold War about different levels of resilience to casualties in different cultures. I mean, one of the reasons why this war is so ferocious and fierce is because we're talking about two like-minded armies fighting each other. They're both babies of the Soviet war machine. They know each other way too well, but they also come from the same type of military culture where resistance to casualties is pretty high compared to Western militaries. Why don't Ukrainians give up if they're losing, say, up to 1,000 personnel a day, according to President Zelensky, who revealed these stats about a month ago? Why they still calling for mobilizations, and we see elderlies joining the fight, females joining the fight, underage joining the fight? Because this is something that is considered to be more acceptable in that circumstance. The same goes for Russia. Russia doesn't notice its casualties. I mean, all this report about the bags will start coming back and people will take to the streets. No, the Russians now volunteering to fight. I mean, there is actually call for mobilization, which is a paradox from our perspective, but there is definitely greater level of resistance and this resilience to heavy casualties on both sides, and acceptance there's going to be heavy casualties, because it's not just the war of attrition. It's almost like an ideological war, because we have two fighting narratives there. But it's also a form of civil war. We need to remember that we have ethnic Ukrainians fight on each side. There are ethnic Ukrainians enlisted in the Russian military and obviously in the Ukrainian military, but equally, there are lots of ethnic Russians fighting within the ranks of the Ukrainian military against ethnic Russians in the Russian military. And as we know, when you enter the civil war, that's where it gets really ugly, where it gets really bloody, it gets really personal. And that's what we're also seeing there. And that also contributes to the progression of the war, because everyone wants to get 100% kill and everyone wants to get 100% win. As
we know, civil wars are the ugliest wars often and hardest to stop. Okay, Dora Marinova, professor at Curtin University Sustainability Policy Institute, who you know well, asks, Are environmental consequences from the war a consideration at all in the geopolitical agenda, which may well include the international one, which obviously includes nuclear power accidents or the potential for nuclear power accidents? I mean, this is a new part of the war. You did mention this was a new feature. We've never had this with nuclear power plants being either under threat or used as shields.
I don't know what Dora has, but clearly she saw the piece that I just about to have published with Sky News this weekend, where actually specifically talk about things we then this war tends to overshadow. And one of them I mentioned is environmental effect. We don't know, I mean, the war that's been so, videotaped and video recorded shows the catastrophic, beyond catastrophic impact on the environment when fuel depots have been targeted on regular basis, when chemical plants have been targeted on regular basis, when army depots, ammunition depots that trigger massive explosions, when forests been burned, fields been wiped out. Again, it's scorched earth over there. We were just living for a moment the risk of nuclear fallout. So we don't know what it would mean for the environment of Ukraine or for the environment of Europe. We don't even think about this, but clearly, if we're thinking about global warming, it's happening right there because of all the fires, of all the explosions, of all the burnings. And it's also happening now when the temperature there exceeds 30 degrees, what pollution of the rivers, pollution of the soils, it's occurring. Just like we don't think of COVID in the context of the war on Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of refugees going through the borders. Do anyone says about safety distance or, whether they're wearing masks or whether they're triple vaxxed? No, they're fleeing for their lives. The war is actually changing and transforming our perceptions on different types of emergencies, different types of cataclysms, human-made as well as environmental. And certainly coming back to the fact that this is the first theater of war where we see fighting occurring on the territory that houses 4 nuclear power stations. Chernobyl is a narrative for a disaster, and the fighting took place in the vicinity of Chernobyl in the early stages. Now we're talking about Europe's largest station being shelled, and the consequences of incidental explosion or even the release, uncontrolled release of nuclear waste, which is also stored in Ukraine, would be far more catastrophic than the outbreak of radiation burst following the explosion on Chernobyl back in April 1986. Now we're not thinking about this. We're not discussing it because right now we're way too politicized about defeating the bastards, defeating the enemy, or winning for that matter. All these matters concerning personal health, people's health, environmental health and security become secondary or thirdly. And when we'll start taking this into account and counting consequences? Well, not before the end of hostilities, but also linked to the question of environmental concern. Think about the problem that Europe will face this winter because of reduced export of Russian energy resources because of sanctions, as well also the energy war that Putin is playing. The fact that Europeans may be forced to reactivate their nuclear power stations, their coal stations, they're quietly packaging and wrapping up the green policies that they've been viciously fighting and lobbying for over the past, God knows how many years. And that's also indirect consequence of this war. If Europe will have to go and start using more coal or even firewood, leave alone, going reactivating their nuclear reactors, that's also a result of this confrontation. So great question.
Okay, these next 2 questions sort of fit together. One's from Andrew Duncan over at the Institute of Public Administration. Hi, Andrew, and anonymous. Andrew asked, how are you able to determine whether Russia is suffering economically, and will their economy fail in time to influence the war? And the next question was, are the sanctions against Russia effective? We talked about how the Russians and other observers overestimated Russia's ability to have a quick victory, if you like. I think we also possibly overestimated the impact of the Western sanctions, which got put together very quickly. Everyone said, Putin wasn't expecting that. But have they actually had much impact? So sanctions and the economy more generally in Russia.
Look, I mean, first of all, I'm not an economist. Secondly, I'm not in Russia. I'm on the other side of Curtin campus, so it's a bit hard for me to judge the real impact on the Russians of these sanctions. If we're talking about sanctions that have been targeting wealthy Russians, I need to remind that over 60% of the Russians will not be affected by the fact that some villas or super yachts or corporate jets or properties in London or the Nice in France will be confiscated, or people cannot do shopping in Milan or something like that, because people cannot afford these things in the first places. People don't have hard currency account, dollar accounts. I mean, not everyone in Russia is that sort of super rich. So for many Russians, it's not going to be affected. The fact that we created perfect storms, I think some 10,000 sanctions were imposed on Russia in the first few months. It became more sanctioned than North Korea and Iran, if not combined, but certainly, it took first place in terms of sanctions being imposed. And somehow we thought that people will take to the streets, that Putin will be overthrown by the coup of oligarchs, etc., etc. Clearly, we misunderstood Russia in this sense. We misunderstood the level of resilience and the level of motivation of the Russians. I mean, I haven't seen so much cheer in Russia for the war. There's been no cheer about Syria. Yeah, it's going fine. It's not second Afghanistan. Carry on. There was no, cheer about Russia's wars in Chechnya. There was massive opposition. Now people are cheering for their troops. People demand victory from Putin. So I guess in this sense, if we expected that somehow Russia's strategic behavior and people's attitudes towards the war will be changed, clearly we have failed, and we have failed miserably because the Russians take the kind of the opposite stand on it. They unite in times of crisis. How it will have an impact on the Russian economy, again, I'm not an economist, and it's really hard to judge, at least for now. It may have longer term effect, but clearly it hasn't had any catastrophic impact of the past, 4 or 5 months.
What about in terms of Russia's war production capabilities? Can Western sanctions prevent, some of its I don't know. I assume there are certain key materials, certain key technologies that they'll need for, sort of replacing equipment that's been destroyed in the war.
Look, I mean, first of all, Russia produces complete inventory of anything people can imagine, so it's pretty self-sufficient. Again, Russia is world number 2 arms exporter, so it produces anything that you may want to use in the combat environment. Second point is Russia was under sanctions since about 2011. So, and certainly Russian defense sector was one of the first that began repositioning itself to become self-reliant. Where Russia finds itself significantly weak, and this is something that's certainly been acknowledged, is in microchip, microelectronics. There was a lot of import of this from Taiwan, and once Taiwan imposed sanctions, that would certainly have some impact on Russian high-tech weaponry. But first of all, Russia can get substitute from China. I'm not saying quality substitute. I mean, the Chinese try to supply Russia, for example, with ship turbines, and they proved to be absolute crap. But the Russians at least can have some temporary solutions coming from the so-called friendly nations. But we also need to remember that Russia is an intellectual power. They can invent things. It will take a long time. They can do something a bit more primitive, perhaps not so super glossy, but they will do, and they're self-reliant in terms of skilled workforce. They're self-reliant in terms of natural resources. They have pretty solid school of mathematics, physics, electronics. The list goes on. So again, we should not be comparing Russia the way how we thought, we could pressure Iraq or Libya or smaller nations. We're talking about the world's largest nation, with also a collection of countries that did not condemn Russia's actions. If we're looking about the list of countries that condemn Russia's actions and impose sanctions, we're talking about some 50 nations at max out of 200. So what happened to another 150 nations?
Okay, good question. Good answer. Now we have to get some quick answers to some quick questions. Helen Verhoff. Hi, Helen. How long can world leaders keep out of the conflict with war crimes against civilians constantly in the public eye? So is that making any difference? The fact that, as you said, it's the most televised war we've ever seen. and we seem to be seeing war crimes in front of our eyes, does that make any difference to the conduct of the war, or whether others might intervene?
Look, I mean, it all comes down to the points I have raised in my second last slide. Nuclear deterrence works. The Western leaders fear Russian nuclear weapons. Yes, we can talk about how Putin will not press the button, or I've seen some commentary in media about now Russian military is crap and certainly their nuclear weapons is crap. But when it comes to making decisions on behalf of the nation, are you going to risk the fact that he may get desperate and actually press the button? And I think that's what really stops Western leaders from interfering. And again, what happened to Russia being accused of downing MH17 didn't go very far in terms of the outcome of that tribunal, unless Russia will suffer militarily miserably and there's going to be a regime change. We will have all sorts of trials on our turf, but it's not going to have any practical consequences for the Russians.
Okay.
Especially if they're going to achieve military success on the ground.
Sure. A quick one here about cyber, and then there's about 3 questions about Taiwan, which I'll put together. So Christy asks, which is a bit like your discussion about the technical capability of Russia, why hasn't Russia's cyber capabilities, which you all hear about in terms of election interference, etc., been as effective against Ukraine? I mean, is Russia using cyber capabilities to try and sort of disrupt Ukraine, or maybe we just don't know about it?
Well, the Russians are not just attacking Ukraine. They've been attacking Ukraine for the past 8 years in terms of cyber, and the cyber offensive has proven to be pretty effective. But we need to remember the Ukrainians got help from all the hackers in the world, certainly Western world. But more recently, the Russian cyber hackers went on a rampage targeting, say, manufacturers of the HIMARS missiles that's supposed to turn change the tide of events on the battlefield. So Lockheed Martin site was down, and their internal cybersecurity network was compromised. More lately, Russia attacked government websites of Latvia because there's been a law passed that Russian citizens will either be deported from Latvia or will not admitted into the country, even if they have Euro visas. So the Russian cyber offensive and the Russian hackers are really, really busy, and I only see acceleration of their efforts and globalization of their efforts. So they're going really viral, but it's not to say that Russia is not taking some serious punishment from counter war that's been mounted by Western hackers against Russia.
Sure. Okay, there's about 3 questions here, all of which probably can be wrapped up to what's the implications of this war for Russia, for US, China, Taiwan relations? I mean, maybe we have to wait a few weeks when Gavin Briggs gives a talk at Curtin Corner, but have you been doing any analysis of the impact of this war and what it might mean for Taiwan, China, US?
Most definitely. Ukraine now, or Russia's actions in Ukraine now, represent a playbook which is carefully studied by the Chinese in terms of learning from the strengths and weaknesses, and certainly by the Americans. Takeaway for the Chinese is, first of all, do not intervene politically like Putin did in the actions of his military. Do not prolong and delay the war, something that China would probably try to avoid. And certainly nuclear weapons do work, because so far the Russians managed to keep the Americans at bay. So far they kept NATO at bay. Yes, NATO and the United States accelerate military aid, but they're very careful in trying to avoid doing anything that would provoke the Russians. And that's a massive learning lessons for the Chinese. Once you press the button, or once you give marching orders, you can effectively say hi to Washington. What are you going to do about it? And that's effectively what Moscow and Putin said. That's why I used the last slide about Darth Vader. There will be no one to stop us this time, because that's exactly what Putin pursued with regards to exercising unilateralism in Ukraine. And I think this is what the Chinese may consider in this sense. Having said that, there is also one important difference between the Ukraine situation and Taiwan situation. Ukraine does not have a defense pact with the United States or NATO. There is no mutual obligations with this respect. Taiwan has a defense pact. The question is whether the United States will continue to honor it, potentially facing Z pressing the button. But that's only time will show.
Now, some very quick ones. Belarus, what's the relationship there? I mean, what's the role that Lukashenko plays in this conflict? Is Belarus basically ceased to be an independent country as a result?
Well, Belarus is part of Russia's invasion. Russia invaded from Belarusian territory. There is still risk that Belarusian forces may interfere and invade Western Ukraine. Russia carries on its strikes from Belarusian territory. So stopping short of sending troops, Lukashenko supports Putin there. As simple as that.
Okay. Africa, will the war have any effect on Russia's relationships with Africa and also the Middle East, I assume, in terms of Syria? It's got, I mean, is it being stretched, and therefore in the Middle East, its attitude in its role in Syria, but also in Africa, is it doing a charm offensive? Clearly, a lot of African countries didn't vote to condemn Russia.
Well, the Russians did charm offensive, and that's why U.S. Secretary Blinken went to Africa to sort of, put his charm on Russia's charm, but it produced mixed results. The African states have mixed feelings about this. There hasn't been overwhelming condemnation. Some countries took hard stand on Russia, but for the majority, they kind of look at Russia simply saying they're the successor of the Soviet Union. The Soviets were nice to us, so why should we be nasty to them? Same goes for the Middle East. Again, we need to remember Russia worked the Middle East very hard over the past 20 years, and it produced results. Biden's trip to the Middle East, especially to Saudi Arabia, proved to be a fiasco. He didn't get the Saudis to increase the production of the extraction of oil to substitute Russian oil. In fact, the Crown Prince made a phone call to the Kremlin after he had a very cold meeting with Biden. On the other hand, the Russians had a good time in Tehran when Lavrov, a Russian foreign minister, made an agreement with the Iranians, and apparently now the Iranians supplying Russia with their drones. Again, there is a very interesting relationship between Russia and Turkey plays in all sort of camps, and certainly is not prepared to compromise relationship with Russia while providing military aid to Ukraine, whilst technically being part of NATO. So Turkey being Turkey, but certainly there is no sort of anti-Russian sentiment in the Middle East, because the Gulf monarchies are looking at it more from the point they're disappointed with the United States rather than they support what Russia is doing. So again, for Russia, the Middle East and Africa is the breeding space where they exploit opportunities and where they're very aggressive in seeking new avenues and certainly new partnerships.
And just working your way around, going from Africa to the Middle East, what about India? I mean, how important is India's stance in basically being hands-off in this campaign?
Really important, because India has obviously, there is an expectation that India is on our side, but again, we need to remember, India is committed to strategic autonomy. Yes, India is a member of the Quad, but also India is the member of the BRICS group, which is Russia's led geopolitical union, as well as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a security network led by Russia and China. So the fact that India has not condemned Russia's action in India has actually increased the import of Russian oil. India continues to acquire Russian arms and continues to have pretty close relationship with Russia, gives Russia an additional breathing space, because between Russia and India, between India and China, Russia says, well, come in, half of the world population is behind us, or at least not condemning us. So what are you talking about in terms of international isolation? Sorry, I cannot pull the Russian accent here.
That's fine. Tim asks again, you mentioned strategic paranoia as basically a rationale for what potentially what Russia's done. Have they sort of overlearned from the past? I mean, is everything about invasion from the West? Is everything about that? I mean, or is this more rationale and excuse for some other objective they've really got in mind here?
Look, I think it's a bit of both, but there is also a lot of domestic politique, and the fact that you like to play the victim, and there is a very strong victim culture in the Slavic culture, but certainly in the Russia culture, and that certainly helps Putin to consolidate his power. That plays a lot of role, but certainly, I mean, if one would study publicly declared justifications of why Russia annexed Crimea, why Russia invaded Ukraine, this is paranoia, because again, we think that Ukraine will invade, we think Ukraine will do that. We have some intelligence, but we're not going to share it with you because it's classified. But trust us on that, etc. So you reach the point, and when you also you do your calculations, and some of the calculations that the Russians doing is actually shared in the West in terms of, yes, the Russians have right to kind of feel concerned about it, especially since there was no written kind of, non-aggression pact reached with NATO, but does it justify you kind of, moving in and invading a sovereign nation? Well, that's where we enter a different dilemma about ethics and, insecurity dilemma in international relations and all other matters that, continue to dominate international affairs and make the world a pretty insecure place.
Okay, last, really, you mentioned about leadership at the end there. Zelensky's leadership, is anything to say about that? Is that, obviously in the West, he's become the hero. Is it reciprocated, do you think, is that happening in Ukraine as well? And is it effective, or because he's obviously not got any combat experience, I'm assuming, and so how has
he hasn't done national service, that's for sure.
Has it surprised you, his leadership, and is it effective, you think?
Look, it did surprise me, and don't get me wrong, but Zelensky should be forever grateful to Putin, because prior to the invasion, he was about to be impeached from his role. His popularity was dropping. There was disrespect for him. The Ukrainians thought of him as a really weak leader, as the leader just pursued his own interests. But then he rose really profoundly, whether because partially of his acting skills or being, and he's certainly a very charismatic guy. He pressed all the right buttons with respect to establishing communications with the West. He worked on his image. The fact that he still has this kind of scruffy looking image, it all plays into his hands. So certainly, the fact that he had no political experience prior to coming into the role. He obviously hasn't even seen active service. And that's a massive challenge for anyone who acts as a Supreme Commander-in-Chief in peacetime, leave alone at wartime. The fact that he didn't have a very experienced team, but nonetheless, he managed to gain support of the Western world. He is now the most recognized political leader. That's all attributions to him. There is no doubt about that. But it all comes also to the question that he is not without challenges, even in Ukraine. There are concerns about the conflict between him and military chiefs. He faces a lot of pressure from elements of the Ukraine right, because they believe he abandoned the Azov regiment, that right-wing, the Russians claim, neo-Nazi military unit in Mariupol, and they believe that he should really pay the price for that. So he faces tough and certainly he is facing tough decisions. We don't know how he is going to play this, because he is now in a really delicate situation, because on one hand he declared an all-out war on Russia. He called for several mobilizations, some of them proved to be quite controversial. He put so much stake into the fact that he wants to fight to the end, to the successful end. I'm not really sure if he would be compelled to find negotiations, how he's going to act on it, also because he's facing, despite the fact that support for him went through the roof in Ukraine, but he's facing some pressure from within the political elements in Ukraine. So, and to be honest, and that's my personal opinion, his lavish photoshoot with Vogue, I don't think it kind of really worked well in terms of, it's good for the image and it's good to be immortalized in a really lavish way, but spending several $100,000 on that at the time when you scrabble for economic aid and your country is under the attack, I think it had a bit of a backfiring effect at him, certainly domestically. And there was some question asked even overseas.
Okay, well, Alexei, I'm just looking at the time we've gone over, but there's still well over 50 people still watching. It's been an excellent and very informative presentation. It's a pretty depressing one, but I guess what else would you expect from having to watch and then to hear about a massive war in Europe? So we're not expecting cheery news, but at least we are much more informed now as a result. So thanks to the Strategic Flashlight forum, and also thanks to our JCIPP regular viewers for hanging in there and watching and asking all those great questions. And we'll be looking at the at the media and the news in the future, and possibly even seeing you as well, Alexei, much more informed than we were before. So thanks very much again.
Thanks very much for all the guests, and thanks very much, John, for putting it all together.
Sure. Now, everyone else, just before you leave, next week's Curtin Corner, we have a change of pace. Richard Harris is had a long time background in government, the energy industry, government relations and communications, and he's at Canning's Purple Strategic Communication. And his title of his talk is Reflections of a Lobbyist, Revealing the Dark Arts. And so a fascinating talk. So that's at 4 o'clock next Friday. Hope you can watch that. And in a few weeks, we will have another talk about China, US, South China Sea. So keep a lookout for that. Okay, thanks once again. Thanks, Alexei, and everyone else. Thanks for joining in. Have a great weekend, and look out on our website for the talk going up on our website if you can watch it again. Thanks very much. Good night.